Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I need to correct some things that I said on Ben Burgess's Colin show, where I talked about the Platypus Affiliated Society without preparation. But to be frank, some of these things I said are things that I have sincerely believed and have not actually ever directly talked to the leadership about. Um, and so need to after having a conversation with one of the three platypus founders, who I deeply respect, correct some things, but also talk about my view of what happened, why I was mad at everyone for a long time, um, and the problems of getting involved in these kinds of organizations. Um, and by getting involved in these kinds of organizations, I'm not talking about platypus. I'm talking about left organizations in general because there are always problems. Um, so for some background, I was a member of Platypus Affiliated Society as a full member from 2012 to 2013. When I no from 2011 to 2013, I believe I was a full member. Although if someone has the documents from that from over 10 years ago, I'd be happy to be corrected. I can tell you what happened though. As I did state on Ben's Collins show, I was disgruntled from my fellow traveler status at the SPUSA in something called the Radical Tendency. And the Radical Tendency was a coalition of some people vaguely attached to the Kasama Project, some former Trotskyist, some active Trotskyist even, who were in the SPUSA and trying to push back on the David McNally or David McReynolds line in the organization. At the time, while the SPUSA was the further left of the three splits of the remaining bit of the post Max Shackman SPA. And if you want to learn about the history of Shackman and Harrington, I have a couple of videos with the scholar Doug Green about that. I was approached by the organization and it was a tiny organization, and the reason why one has to clarify this, since I hear, I'll flash this up on the screen, no one cares, this is the dumbest navel gazing nonsense. Well, actually, no one should care except who I'm apologizing to. I was asked these questions. I did not bring them up. When I went on Ben's Collins show, we did not talk about any topic, and I was not expecting to talk about my past sectarian affiliations. And I was giving the history for context. Now, it doesn't really matter my own personal history. It matters what I say. And I said some things about Platypus that I believed that I got from other members in the organization through rumors that were not true. And since I have integrity requires that you fix that. It is not navel gazing nonsense to make an apology and also explain why you were ever involved in the first place. Because there have been whole crusades about this organization, some of which I have found quite silly. back when the International Socialist Organization was still a thing, there were people in it who would literally harass me just because I had some prior affiliation with the Platypus Affiliated Society. And I don't know what their deal was. They also had a problem with Fan Bing, who is the ostensible author and editor of the North Star that I was working for, but it was a real deal. Now, these petty and sectarian beefs often have real consequences. I've known organizations to fall apart from them. I've known people to radically misrepresent other people. And what I'm trying to model here is how you don't do that. If you make a mistake, you get off your ass, even though I've done 3 fucking casts today, and you correct it. So I said that Spencer Leonard had been a member of the IBT. That is apparently not true. Chris Catron was a member of the Spartacus League, I believe. At least that's what I've been told by membership. I also said that that I don't think there was the leadership had studied a lot of Marxist economics because it was not in the curriculum or the organization. And I will stand by the second half of that, at least in the curriculum. No, you don't get it. I mean, like, don't bro me. We're not bros. I'm not your brother. See, this is why I have a problem doing no one really cares about the Marxist infighting from 20 years ago. Uh that's true. Although you're wrong about the timeline, it was 10. Um what what I was actually confused is I was not expecting to be asked about it. So I spoke off the cuff and I said things that were incorrect. Um I've also told people that you should probably be very careful with any sectarian organization because they are given to infighting. And by sectarian organizations, I also mean sectarian organizations within larger organizations, such as tendencies within the DSA. Fuck, I don't really think you should be in the DSA. I'm going to say it out loud. Like, um, if you want to go where the people are in unions and in order organizations. They are not in a leftist advocacy group, even if it's 100,000 people. Um, but what we do have to be is thick-skinned and honest about what we have done and have said. And I have in the past, well, I really have been one of these sectarian people. The confusion of leaving that organization, and I left it with some people who were later on, and I'm not going to name names here because I am talking about people who seemingly had total breaks and have renounced all their life in the left, um, who were highly motivated and were doing things like leaking entire listservs between one organization and another. Like, and that put a very sour taste in my mouth about anything on the left. And given that I was in a foreign country and doing stuff there, um, I I actually, and this is navel gazing. I went into seclusion from 2014 to about 2016. Um, and what brought me out of that seclusion was I was trying to start, you know, commentating on left wing theory again with Amog Sahu, who was really trying to work through some things. And we would record a show and irregularly release it like once every 4 months. Um, And while I was working for Zero Books, I was asked to, hey, maybe you can help us produce more additional content. And so I went back from being a largely private figure who only really commented um, on other people's manuscripts to being a public commentator again. Um, the other thing that really brought that out uh, was the suicide of Mark Fisher, and then two other of my leftist friends died prematurely, although not from suicide. Um, and I became highly motivated, but I was still really angry. I was very angry. Um, I had also involved myself in some other organizations, but I tried to play a very quiet role. And started this project called Emancipation Project, which again, no one cares about this. To explore some of the same questions that got me into this world in the first place. I mean, the reason why I had ever reached out, and I was the one who reached out to the Platypus Affiliated Society in 2011, was not just this weird infighting over Trots and Maoist and this shit about the SPUSA, but to try to understand what the history was and why we were all in these weird ass sectarian organizations. Like, I had this question gleaming in my head. All right. In 1972, if you read Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air, there was probably in all the left organizations, both in the SDS and otherwise, about 1 million people in the United States alone. Now that I think that's an overstated number, but it was way more than now. And the question that I had that was always on my mind is, why had these organizations not been able to do anything with that? And why did no one ask, like, where did all these people go? Um, because I was just in this tiny sectarian organization, which is not even that sectarian. It was a broad tendency organization. Um, and it was a few hundred people, but it didn't even have a chapter in my home state, right? You want to talk about petty, right? Like, that's what we were dealing with. And I was reading the stuff from just before my birth and going like, where the fuck are all these people? Where did they all go? And why did they leave? And we were constantly in denouncements and rap, what I consider rap beef kayfabe bullshit. Um, and like every other day, particularly when I was in Platypus, every other day there was some denouncement of somebody over something, and you'd read it and you would like know these people, and you go, that's not even true. That's the least charitable reading you could possibly take about that. And it got even worse when I started dealing with like left communism. I started dealing with people who like had would just bracket out whole categories of groups of people based off of like their specific stance and interpretation of this one thing, Bordiga or Panacook did. And then this French organization. I mean, like, no, like, even trying to learn are the arcana, which I have sincerely tried to do, was a waste of time because you couldn't keep up with it. I'd happy to have you on, Sam. We'll talk. Actually, if you look in the show notes on YouTube, you can find my email address, and we can come on. So I don't like encouraging further sectarianism. Now, one thing I will say is as a non-sectarian, right? Like, I am hyper opinionated, hyper partisan. I'm a partisan of one, you know. You could call me my own political cult of me. But I do believe that we have to be thick-skinned enough to deal with all kinds of different people. And we have to be honest in our dealings with them. And we have to um, be fair. So um, I, you know, I came with this, and I am gonna read something from Platypus a little bit because this is the part that got me in the organization. I read this statement, okay, and like I read this statement. Well, this was posted in 2013, but I swear to you, I read it in 2011 because I wouldn't have contacted the head of the New York chapter otherwise. Oh well, yeah, yeah. Oh, we'll get to that in a minute. Platypus is a project for self criticism, self education, and ultimately for the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. At the present, the Marxian left appears to be a historical ruin. The received wisdom of today dictates that the past failed attempts at emancipation stand not as monuments to potential yet to be redeemed, but rather what? Utopianism that was bound in the end to tragedy. As the critical inheritors of a vanquished tradition, Platypus contends that the failure of the 1960s New Left and the dismantlement of the welfare state and the destruction of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 90s, the present disorientation of the left means we can hardly claim to know the task and goals of social emancipation better than the utopians of the past did. And those lines right there spoke to me when I was 31 years old and really, really, really disillusioned. I've been disillusioned with the left twice. Once as a teenager going into the anti-war movement in college, and um once as someone at the time who uh had just kind of tried to be a fellow traveler to a socialist organization before Occupy. And then when Occupy happened, um that's when I was actually, in that winter. So I guess it was 2012. At winter I was inducted into as a full member of Platypus, and I just wanted to see where we were going. I had such like I actually had hopefulness again. Not that Occupy was going to succeed. I mean, every time David Graeber spoke at Occupy, I would get mad. Like I would get in fights with him on Twitter, and I was a nobody. I would just harass him. Typical Twitter behavior. um and and But I had a lot of hope that the way that was going to fail was going to teach us a lot, that we were going to move past this moment of being stuck, of not knowing what to do with unions, not knowing what to do with all these students, and and the students, you know, um, I tell the story a lot, and I talk a lot about these things. I was sitting in a bar in Brooklyn after Occupy. I'd gone down there to meet some of the people. I was on. It was a really strange time in my life. Not going to go into the personal stuff, but I was going through a lot of personal stuff, and um, I met this guy from Crime Think at the bar, and he made fun of me because my Mandarin was shit. I mean, and still shit. I don't really speak Mandarin, and my Korean was self-taught and very, very, very picking up phrases from the street. Um, it- the failure conversation, and actually, it wasn't part of your conversation; it was part of mine. Um, uh, the failure conversation is interesting to deal with, right? In so much that Occupy was sold to some people, and I say some people because I also went to Occupy Yoedo and Occupy Taipei. because of the nature of my job and because I was living in South Korea at the time. I was way more involved in Occupy Yoedo than I was in anything in the United States. Um, and I also got to see Occupy Oakland. It was a very strange time, right? Very strange time. Um, and I wanted to figure out what was going to happen. What was happening in Occupy Yoedo was that there was kind of two major movements. There's kind of like this young internationalist college movement that really wanted to push back on the banks, and then there was this kind of older, more nationalist, um, barely left element of that. And a few things happened that there was a crackdown on Occupy Yodo, just like there was a crackdown on a lot of occupies. And also Kim Jong-un, who had just came to power, said something positive about it in the paper, which made it open to the national security law, so everybody bailed. And who began to seem to represent it was that way more nationalist, not even left nationalist, just nationalist side, pushing back on things like uh, more immigration to the Republic of Korea and stuff like that. And uh, I was like experiencing that, and then listening to like Graeber speeches and stuff. I don't claim to know what went down at Occupy Wall Street because I was only there for like a week. But my experience of it was sitting down in Brooklyn on this big academic trip that I was going, and I was also like moving my life. I was finishing relocating my life outside of the United States. I was going to visit my best friend in Oakland. I had driven in a bus, actually. God, this was such a strange time. I had driven in a bus. I didn't drive. I was ridden in a bus from before people start thinking I was well off. From Oakland into DC, stayed with my childhood best friend, went to DC to this winter Occupy meeting, and hung out with a bunch of people at Platypus to see if I actually wanted to fully join the organization. Oh yeah, I do remember the Libertarians. It was crazy. And actually, the Libertarians reminded me of my when I was 18 and my very first experience of the left, which was traveling across country with friends to the Battle for Seattle, and like somehow seeing Pat Buchanan. Like it's the only time I've ever seen Pat Buchanan in person. It's very weird. So that was like the bookends, right? Of like the end of the altern globalization movement, from kind of like its like peak moment to when it completely sort of dissolves and Occupy. And I really thought, and I had a lot of hope about this, that like this was going to be an evolution, and it was, but it wasn't the evolution I wanted. All right, I'll get to that in a little while. Well, after about a year later, I just I had a fallout with Platypus. It was mostly about people that I knew in the organization leaving or getting expelled, and for reasons that I will completely admit I don't understand. Yeah, sure. Shout out to Argentina. At least you beat the settler colonials, the French. Although, never mind. I'm not going to start a fight. Football fights are worse than sectarian left fights. So you know, so I was really bitter about that. I had questions about that organization, and I didn't really have ways to get answers. I couldn't go to the national conference. I was in another fucking country by that point. I was back in Korea. And I also didn't have a lot to do. Like I had moved universities from Yongin-shi into Daejeon. That doesn't mean anything to you probably, but that's right outside of Seoul to like the center of rock. Um, so there there is so I didn't like there was no one out there. Like I was in rural Korea. No, rural Korea is still a city with more people in it than the entire states of Wyoming, the Dakotas, and this is one you could throw like there's a bigger population in Daejeon, but you know, like to the people in Seoul, that's like Daejeon's like the boondocks, even though it's like a half million person city, you know, like but anyway, so I didn't have anything to do. Um I was more and more involved with Doug Lane's projects. I was starting a literary magazine with a former member of Platypus. Um and I was in a uh my ex-wife is from Wyoming. That's my evidence for that. Um and so I was in with a whole lot of people who left the organization very bitterly. Now I have my questions about this, and I would rather ask them, but I'm not going to misstate anything about anybody if I know and I'm corrected and I believe they're acting in good faith. And in this case, I do believe they are, because the corrections were mostly nominal, and we had some discussions that clarified some things that probably should have happened 10 years ago. Um, I've invited them on to talk about their position because I actually think it would be useful. I've learned a lot from these exchanges. Um, but it brings me to my mission. You know, I read the first part of the statement of purpose of Platypus, which was the thing that got me in the organization, right? And say what you will about anything that you believe about them. That statement, it feels true to me. My issue with them became though that I didn't think self criticism was good enough, right? Like the self criticism of the left by the left uh, didn't feel like it was enough. There were larger contexts than the left's problems. The problems weren't just ideas; they were um, they were the whole context around the ideas. Like, why were these ideas the ideas that were most likely to survive? Why were they so attractive one minute and not the next? Like, why are we all, yeah, coming out from an Busters hashtag and then helping people riot in the streets and BLM, and then within a year, it's a university discourse, and then when it happens again after Floyd, it's a media discourse, and it's even part of HR training. Like that blue, like the question of that is not just the ideas themselves. The question becomes like, why is this? So one, I actually agreed. There's a comment here. And it's the person who asked me to shout out Argentina for the World Cup. Um, uh, Self-criticism without positive heuristic towards a collective projective towards socialism is self-defeating, and I think that's completely true. Right. Um, so I started noticing a few things. One, the return of Marxist-Leninism from people who weren't even like like they didn't come to it uh, from Marxism. You started seeing all these other ideas that weren't even part of historical Marxist-Leninism being pulled from everywhere into that milieu. Two, um, and I don't go off on like sectarian origins. In fact, like I've worked with plenty of Marxist Leninists who actually ended up being good people, but they often don't really know the histories of their own organizations, or or why they do what they do, or like the debates in within the Soviet Union that didn't get purged, you know, are Stalin's changes of opinion or any of that. Like, so I was like, well, what is this? This is very facile. Why is this existing? I also started seeing, like, I have never really understood why the Trotskyist organizations were still divided after 1992, except for habit. Like, I was like, look, you guys were all fighting about the Soviet Union. From my standpoint, none of you called it exactly right. A lot of you called elements of it, but none of you got it all right. And um, why are we still fighting over like whether or not it's a deformed worker state or a bureaucratic collectivism, or whether or not the new class was a new class or a new caste, which version of Trotsky? Like, that made no sense to me. And then I went on this project. This was after anything to do with Platypus. I was in this thing called the Red Party, and I sat down with Esri XKB, and we started reading every political platform that we could find for any left organization, left com, anarchist, doesn't matter, right? I even looked at Crime Think. I didn't finish my story. The Crime Think guy shamed me for speaking bad Korean, right? And I was like, why am I getting class shamed by an anarchist in a bar? Like, I mean, this motherfucker goes to Sarah Lawrence. like, what does he do? Like, and my immediate response was to, like, I don't know. I wanted to, you guys know me. Well, you don't know me actually, but if you do know me, I'm kind of prone to challenging people to fights, and that was my first impulse, and I like swallowed it down because I'm like, okay, no, this is not the right thing to do. Also, I'm in New York, and I'll probably get arrested. This is not like being in a bar in Macon. So I started like mapping on all these organizations and just like seeing what they said. Yeah. Drinking and arguments do not go. Yes, you're right. Drinking and arguments don't go well with me. You are correct. This is why I now only drink on special occasions. And I also started looking at anarchist organizations and groupings this way, and just started like tracing their positions. And I was like, fuck, man, their theoretical positions don't actually lead to immediate political positions a lot of the time, and they're utterly inconsistent. And it's like everybody, right? Like, has Varn ever been arrested? Yes. Has Varn ever been convicted? No. All right. That's why I can be a teacher. I'll just answer that question for you. Yes, I have. No, I have not ever been convicted of anything or even charged, but I have been arrested. But yeah, that is the responsible way to save one's honor as a dance off. Unfortunately, I can't dance. I can do a lot of things, but dancing is not really one of them. So I just came to this conclusion that despite all this study, and I had studied, like, I have spent years reading Marx and the footnotes in Marx. I was like, this is when Marx wrote this when he was sick, and this is what he was doing with the International. I still get stuff wrong because I am getting old and my memory's not as good as it used to be. And I know I look like, I don't know how old you guys think I look, but I'm well over 40. Um, um, so you had all this, and I still had all this anger. And the one thing I can tell you is never use your politics as therapy. Never ever use your politics as therapy. It's bad for everyone. It's bad for you. It's bad for your comrades. It's just bad, right? Don't do it. And I forgot what it was. There was something. I had some argument with Catrone on Facebook after like 7 years of like blocking every plot I knew except for like 3 people. And I invited him on. We had this long conversation, and I felt like, despite having interacted with this man, for literally, many years, that I didn't really understand what even I've been taught. And I wanted to admit that because I've said that I think a lot of people who I've known who've gone through Platypus don't really understand the purpose of the organization. Um, I include myself in that. Now, that means that you should take a lot of what I say about it with a grain of salt. Um, and a lot of people who gave me information, and this is not to excuse my own recounting of basically gossip, because I didn't verify it. Yeah, I would actually agree with that. My main critique of Platypus is they do these provocation statements to break through, and I don't think they work. I think they actually like retrench people and get people into knots that aren't helpful. Um, but but uh, when I have spent time and like asked them follow-up questions and made them make follow-up questions, I often find that they're not as unreasonable as they seem. That I'm like, well, why did you make the statement that way? That is a frustration which I have. But I also think we have to be thick-skinned. Um, isn't it just kind of contrarianism, or do they really believe all of it? They really believe a lot of it. Okay, I will say that. Like, I never got the when I was in the organization, I never got the feeling um that they didn't mean what they said. But I never really understood what some of those statements were meant to do. So it um it it is a discourse about the left, from the left, that's also critical of the left. It's in this weird, like, tripartite, like, I am outside and inside at once. I mean, I guess it's kind of what the DSA sees itself to the Democratic Party, right? But it is such a discourse that I think can be impenetrable, even to people who are inside it. Um, and so, for example, I initially started the show way, way back in 2000 when I was still in Platypus, called Pop the Left. Um, and I mean, the first thing we would do is like, oh, we would pit, like, we did all the basic bitch shit, like talk about, excuse me, basic bay. I should not, you know, I should not be so flippant, but and maybe unconsciously masculinist. Um, there, there's this weird uh tendency that we had to, like, when I was doing that show, one, to get caught up in the moment. Um, and the other was to, like, oversimplify the positions of people, like Chomsky versus Marxism. Like, that's not really that helpful. It's just not. Like, um, well, it wouldn't be the first time I've been canceled. Canceled a lot in my life. Um, uh, the 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 help with the memory. Yeah, well, I do take a lot of omega-3s. Um, I have other issues with memory, and I'm not going to get down. I don't love doing the whole psychological history thing that's often tied up with that. Um, so so I have really felt kind of shitty about unintentionally misrepresenting anyone. And you know, I haven't just done it to to Platypus Affiliated Society. I accidentally did it to Andrew Kleiman once, and then like I apologized and like sincerely tried to understand him. And he denounced me anyway, but like I did due diligence. Um I will go further. Marxism versus modern social anarchism is large. I actually agree. The difference is how fast you want to like take apart the state. Um so so this is my apology. This is my mea culpa. I've actually invited the founders of Platypus, who are still doing public appearance, to come on and talk to me about our differences and also anything that I've said that they feel is untrue. Um, and while I will definitely push back on things that I've directly experienced if they say that that's not correct, but I don't see them doing that. They've never done that to me. Um, Not the leadership anyway. Um, so I have a question, and I can take some questions. I will also admit, guys, this is my 4th podcast today, and I've graded 3 finals and written a class, but I can't sleep. So I'm finishing this, and I felt like this needed to be addressed, but I am willing to take some questions. Uh, Persa asks, Mongosera Persa asks, at some point when you are finished with your points, I want to bring up a controversial point to you that I've been wanting to bring up to you for a year or so. Sure. Um, um, and I'm going to endorse this. Check out Anarch series on Modern Anarchists for this. I think the more left tendencies can learn about each other, is important. Actually, for example, if you wanted to know my bugbear, I am deeply conflicted about modern monetary theory. It's like the thing that keeps me up at night, because there's elements of it that I think are like highly explanatory, and there's elements of it that I'm like, what? You know? And every time I talk to someone, they talk to me like I'm crazy and haven't spent a long time studying economics. And then I'm like, but no. And we tease it apart, right? And so I've actually become really interested in going through and saying, like, you know, I don't accept this argument from Roy Mosler, but can you explain it to me? Can you make sure that not only do I understand it, but that my audience understand it? So if they reject it, they at least know what the fuck they're rejecting, right? That's a huge deal. Like, I've heard people reject shit based off of inclination or personal bias or sectarian affiliation that like is based off of genealogical arguments, but not anything to do with substance. I've even had to like try to pull back my own tendency that I've kind of inculcated, because this is a left tendency in general, to argue from, well, you believe this, so are the kind of, it's not quite ad hominem technically, because ad hominem texts are supposed to be completely spurious. But it's ad hominem enough that I go, okay, I should approach you personally with a heuristic of suspicion, and often a heuristic of suspicion from identity, whatever that identity is. And I don't find that particularly helpful. And I realize that okay, I will get to this in a second. I realize that that's, there is a way in which when we deal with these people, we should keep those things in mind, right? We don't want to be fooled. We do know that everyone argues from a point, in that point is informed by political past. When you're going to see, I'm actually doing a long, and I say long, like a long series on the different theories and classifications and typologies of class. And instead of doing the normal Marxist thing that everyone does, like, well, only the Marxist class is real, I'm actually taking the viewpoint of, I'm going to assume in the beginning that this is at least attempting to describe something real. We're going to figure out what it is describing and then figure out where it differs from other ways of describing it. Right. But to do that, I often do have to go through the political histories of each sociologist, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century. But I don't think you should dismiss something. There are even things that I feel like I failed on. For example, when I was talking about the revolutionary conservatives, there are arguments that Ernst Jünger makes, for example, that I actually agree with, right? And I often don't talk about it because I don't want to be accused of being a sympathizer, and I'm not a sympathizer. But that doesn't mean that they can't say something true. When I was more of an edgelord, I actually sometimes used to do this. I would like quote people that I liked, like Pasolini, and quote stuff that they said that was kind of messed up, and then I would quote people that I didn't like proto-fascist in Italy, and quote things that I thought were true, and see if my audience could tell the difference. So yeah. So here's the questions on so I only see one comment. So even though it's not under the name in the thing, it's not under the same name, I'm going to read this, and I believe this is Persa. Persa, if I'm wrong, just tell me. Some thoughts of what Sam Kangarloo says is thought-provoking, but I'm not convinced of some of his arguments. One, the framing of economics having capitalist features I find endemic. This implies that states are neutral. While Sam does not believe in the neutrality of states from an anarchist point of view, he seems to talk like they are because it is assumed in chartalism. I've actually, in my way back on a debate I did with Sam, and then I mentioned this point again in a debate with Max Seho of Money from the Left slash what's the other podcast? Well, it's on the Money from the Left, it's a sub podcast. I actually probably don't know if I'm agreeing with anarchists. I'll actually go and explore this. I trust when my audience suggests something. Usually, it's not stupid, so I just share it. So I'll get back to this question. That I suggested that one of the problems with the historical school, and the historical school includes former socialists like Max Weber and Werner Sombart. And Sombart, we can go into Sombart. I'm going to do a whole video on him. But also Charles Knapp, who used to identify as a Marxist, and other members of the historical school. Karl Knapp's chartalism, it was actually tied into Lassallean socialism, and LaSalle thought he was a Marxist and was strongly corrected by Marx. Although, Marx cried at his funeral when he died, blah blah blah. But he also kept every member of his organization out of any organization founded by LaSalle until after LaSalle was dead. LaSalle thought that the state was neutral, and that led him to think that you could make. There's the secret letters to Bismarck, for example, that he was literally trying to form an aristocratic worker alliance against the bourgeoisie. And that he thought that the rule of law could be neutral and that law was not a classed organ. Now, occasionally you will hear people claim, Leninist of all varieties sometimes claims that because Lenin goes back and forth from this in different time periods, he tries to go into historical materialism, the different class contestations within the state means that temporarily the state may be class neutral. But that capitalism is the dominant form in the economy because the primary driver in international trade is not rents, it's commodities. And it's not even commodities for general consumption. It's commodities for like mass production. It's the stuff that keeps the military going and the energy sector going, and that holds the economy together. And while MMTers theoretically kind of agree with this, like they will say that the limits of your prosperity is like your material limits. That is an MMT, particularly the chartalist form of MMT. Um, uh, uh, assumption. There is a way in which like there's some haziness in the way they talk about this, because they also want to push back on the assertion made by Marxists that say like, okay, fine, after once we change from commodity money to commodity backed money into fiat currency, that sure, like the relationship to commodities is hyper obscured and money is not a commodity anymore. The cost of money is not the cost of the commodity, but the cost of maintaining the money market, right? Um, but and so they want to say any country, no matter how small, can do that, or it can exist in some spectrum of sovereignty. And I just don't think that's true. And I also don't. I think there's there's a kind of almost Emil Durkheim assumption, and then this is an assumption of the historicist school. It is not unique to MMT, but it does go back to Knapp. It goes back to the origins of the thought, all right, to the end of the 19th and early 20th century, that states are like organic units and they can function as an organic unit for communities of care, etc. And I don't think classes work that way. I don't think caste divisions and other social divisions work that way. I don't think you can have a prolonged social peace without the expense. And even when you have a social peace, there's still got to be, for the society to hold together, in a competitive way, somebody excluded from the table, right? And you can make that sub-demographics of the working class. You can racialize it. You can genderize it. You can make it the semi-proletarianized, whatever. But it's got to be there because you need that threat to make the market commodity. You got to keep full employment from having if you're a capitalist. You just do. Full employment is something that you fear if you're not in a completely enclosed system. And capitalism is not ever a completely enclosed state system. So that's my critique of that question. The reason this is not being implemented is because it's ideological. Yeah, I just don't think that. I literally talked to an MMT. Oops, listen to myself. I'm literally talked to an MMT friend about this today, and my MMT friend agreed with me that no, the problem is that a lot of these countries need physical commodities to build up their productive sector. To get that, they have to have reserve currencies that'll be accepted by the places that have those things. And they have to trade in those reserve currencies until they have enough to produce enough in their own block to resist that other highly productive block, right? Like, because autarkies would only work if you're in a simple enough economy that you can produce everything that you need with the kinds of minerals that are going to exist anywhere on Earth. Well, I hate to tell you, buddy, but anthropologically, that's nowhere. Not even the United States has total, I will have MNTers can't admit this to me. They're not even the United States has total currency sovereignty because there's certain things they do have to get from certain people. And yes, we have the largest military the world's ever known. So you can like do stuff with that. But there's still certain games we have to play on somebody else's terms. You know, Now, I actually started going into this when I was, and so I don't think that's ideological at all. Now, it might be ideological that, like, what you could say is ideological is that, okay, well, why doesn't like South America, under the auspices of like a joint, a joint leadership of like, let's say Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil, um, who have very different, resources, come together and do like, a southern, a South American currency block. Now that could theoretically push back against the U.S. currency block, except for the fact that the U.S. also controls most of the trade lanes because its military controls most of the blue water trade lanes, not all of them. And one of the things about multipolarity that people talk about, one of the things that I mean, one of that means is different people are controlling aspects of the trade lanes. All right. Um, yeah. Oh yeah. Marx does not believe in the neutrality of the state. He says that explicitly. He the ambiguity in Marx is that, in fact, I don't think Marx ever believed in the neutrality of the state. The ambiguity in Marx is that uh Marx seems to think that if the like a state form could be a transitional thing if it was run by the working class, and had things like labor tokens, which are like not this basically non-fungible currency. Um and then you could deal with the fact that so much has been put into the state to avoid the social collapse. Now, here's the problem with that is the state's way more powerful now than when Marx was thinking about it. And this is something to really take into account. And this is why a lot of Marxists now just do not talk about Marxist uh, stuff about the state and critique of the Goethe program, on the war in France, on uh, and it's implied in the Brumaire. Um, no, Bonapartism. See, this is the Bonapartism implies that there could be such a height of class conflict that the bourgeoisie would allow elements of prior societies to become dominant to maintain order and give some suffice to other parts of society. That's not neutrality. The Bonapartist figure is inherently unstable because they only are allowed to exist to restabilize trade, and thus anything that they bring up from prior societies, such as imperial decree or this and the other, is accepted only in those pretense. And the moment they can't do that, they're done away with. So that's the Marxist theory of that. Um, No, it's actually just real quick. How this started is I actually owed Platypus Affiliated Society an apology, and I made it, and then talked about why I made it. Um, so there's a continuity between that and say Fordism, which is like we're going to, in private means, let workers have a seat at the managerial table of the production of society, but we're going to do it in a more privatized way than, say, uh, social democracy, and we're going to back it up with some sort of welfare state. But by doing that, you actually move more and more of the functions you blur that Fordism's already blurring the lines between the public and private sector to the favor of the private sector, and then you just kick labor out, and that's neoliberalism. So a lot of people think that, like, oh, they have this heyday for Fordism and New Dealism and America. New Dealism is American Bonapartism, really, because it really is factored into really one man, and they don't want to deal with the fact that each one of those structures has set up structures that have changed parts of the management of the nations in capital in such a way that the next step is a little easier to do. Um, Sam, you did fine. I did not end madly and cut the stream and threaten to fight you. So, 4. Uh, Government set prices. This is definitely a reach. Currency creation is done as the government through its mediation and compromise between class forces internally and externally. That is not the same thing as government setting prices. Yeah, it's not the same thing as government setting prices. It's government being able to use monopoly power to highly influence prices. It's the way that like big corporations and insurance companies can influence the insurance market. But you will know that uh insurance companies actually can't control out of exploding medical cost either. um and that's important to understand, right? Because monopoly, yes, the government does have monopoly pricing power in some areas. As I've said, I granted to Sam, he's right that like in say semi-skilled labor, the largest purchaser of semi-skilled labor in any country will usually be its government now. All right. If it's even a middle income country. Um, and that's that's one thing, but uh, like even the United States can't set the price for all commodities. Look at grain, and the United States has enough grain for itself, but yet it is subject to a grain market that's international. Look at oil. Sam talks about oil is cartelized, so it's so it's different. And I'm like, so it's a state, but I'm like, it's actually a cartelized thing that exists between multiple states who have to work in coalition with each other, and no one can really deal with that. And that's why that's why futures markets exist. That's not ideological. Now, I've told Sam that I think this all works out on paper if you only look at it as an accountant, and lo and behold, a lot of the people who look at it this way are, stock accountants and stuff. And I also have told them that I disagree, for example, that buying back privately held government bonds, which is the difference between market operations, which is buying back privately held government bonds, but it's only technically privately held because they're held by the Treasury, versus buying back private bonds from individual corporations, which is part of quantitative easing, as done first by Japan and then by the United States and by everybody, and discontinued in the last 2 years, is actually a huge distinction. And a lot of MMTers, Warren Mosler being among them, don't think that that's a huge distinction. And I'm just like, well, because they're like, well, they're not actually buying. I'm like, they're making bond, they're making bond debt disappear. I mean, they're moving money around in ways that I don't think where I agree with Sam is I don't see a lot of evidence that it actually increases the monetary supply, but I do see a ton of evidence that it made things like risky venture capital safer. Because the moment we stopped doing QE, venture capital started plummeting. And when venture capital started plummeting, which is based at like you started realizing how much the returns on venture capital were being used against debt, which was the only way a lot of rentier tech companies were profitable. Which is also why like this whole techno neo feudalism thing isn't really a threat, right? So there's both the jure and de facto, and a lot of times when you hear there's a weird conflation between the jure and de facto, and there's also some conflation between normative and descriptive. Like MMTers will always tell you that most of what they're doing is a descriptive reality, but then they will redefine things. Definitions are fucking normative, all right? And these definitions really matter for some of the things that they're saying to be true. When you say X equals Y and you redefine Y to be the same as X, but that's not really how the rest of the world understands it, that makes the descriptive part of it a lot less clear. So that's one of the ways where I say there's often a mild and subtle conflation in normative and descriptive in some MMTers. Colin Drum, who's a guy even more ornery than me, God bless him, is actually really good on this. Like, he also talks about what's left out of these histories, and you can go read John Michael Cologne and Steve. Oh God, what's his name? Steve Mann. I should look up my own archives. But I will say there's a lot of things MMTers say that are useful and true against, say, monetarists, or like the way economists will write about, like, oh, we can't do this because we can't afford it. You can afford whatever doesn't cause you inflation. And there is a sense in which the MMPers are right. Inflation is really about what people can get away with charging and relations of production. Like, and while they're like, I agree with Sam, there's like at least three forms of inflation. There's demand pull, cost push, and basically price gouging. And demand cost push inflation is the big driver of inflation, and there's a lot of evidence that once you have cost push inflation, people opportunistically raise their price in their own field because they can get away with it. So people who don't have the cost will raise their prices because they can recoup more, because it plays against other things in the market. So that's my take on my differences with Sam. But I think, like, when you first hear MMT and the initial things they say, that like, yes, there's no fucking way a country doesn't run out of money. A country loses control of its monetary supply, and it doesn't lose control of the monetary supply even because of like how much debt there is. And there is a real sense in which under fiat currency, debt is the creation of money. And if you suck a lot of that up, you have to shrink the economy accordingly. Like, that's true. But the thing is, that's true within a nation, but capitalism is not within a nation. Like, it's not within one nation. Like, if there's anything that people should just disabuse themselves of, it's national autarky and capital. Now, MMTers say they don't believe that, and there's some who don't. I actually, like, this is why I get very frustrated with one thing I get very frustrated with modern monetary theorists on the show is, like, I really like Sam. I agree with him on a lot of things. I think he presents this really well. That's why I have him on. He presents very simply. I really like Andres Bernal, who I haven't had on a long time, but I want to have on again. And I think he presents some things really well. But Stephanie Kelton, who I am less sanguine about, presents certain things about it really well. Tankist does too. But there are times where I just feel like you're dropping part of the picture, and that part of the picture that you're dropping is important. All right, last question of this first thing. Venezuela's social spending has some hard limits that came to the surface with the energy price collapse of the mid-teens. Absolutely. And I've been very frustrated with people who see that as solely orchestrated by the U.S. on geopolitical terms. Well, I do think the U.S. tipped its scale. The U.S. also was hurting itself in doing so. It kind of collapsed the economy of Wyoming and Dakotas and a lot of the energy stuff. Yeah. Well, national autarky is the first step to state capitalism, except that state capitalism is not viable unless it's an international market, and thus the autarky, it can't be real. And most states can't pull autarkist conditions off. They just can't. So we can get into that too. The allegations that adopting MNT wouldn't complicate their access to the global market and international investment is highly suspicious. I totally agree. I don't think. I think Argentina and Egypt, and I could talk about Egypt if you want me to talk about Egypt, because Egypt's a good example of this. Egypt's in a very particular situation. For a long time, it pegged its currency and had a two-tier exchange system. They had the official exchange system and a black market exchange system. And in 2016, the IMF and China mutually both. So let's always talk about that when people think it's just the IMF. And China, I'm not saying China was trying to do any debt peonage. They weren't. They were just playing within the rules of the market in which they existed. asked put pressure on the government to free float the currency on an official exchange, and the currency and the official exchange rate collapsed. It fucking collapsed. They didn't try to put a whole lot of hold reserves to keep currency in, which led to a lot of problems for me. Don't cry for me too much, even though I was technically an undocumented or an incorrectly documented person. I wasn't being hit too hard. I was able to support my spouse through cancer with this money, but the reason why it was so valuable for me is while I got paid mostly in pounds, it was pegged to the dollar. It's pegged to the dollar because you don't get people like me to come do things and buy things to bring into the school unless you pay us in dollars. So that assumption, because we had to get things from outside of the country, and this was like whole markets. It wasn't just like us, like our educational enterprise had to do this. It just I was just like, so when I was still hearing people say that like Syriza could have done whatever in Greece and it could have gone, and I was like, you are full of shit, because I lived through that. I saw what it was not possible. The only way it could have been possible is if there had been a responsible trade development done in North Africa as a whole, and they had like an agreement with them and maybe Saudi Arabia to like have a currency exchange, and Saudi like trade for oil with Egypt in Egyptian pounds, which Saudi was more willing to highly subsidize the government than it was to with dollars at its own cost, than it both governments, both the Brotherhood and the LCC government, than it was to break the dollar trade thing. So when they free floated the currency collapsed. All right, I lived through it. I know, I was there, and like we had food riots, and like workers that I knew disappeared because of the food riots they were organizing, and the military would round them up. I don't think they were killed, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just going to be honest about that. I don't know what happened to them. They were probably in the prison across the street from me, frankly. So this there was, however, in Professor Katoub talks a lot about this, but I think he drew maybe too optimistic conclusions from it. Because of this, there was a lot of booing up of the economy. Egypt went through this thing. Its currency vastly depreciated, but that made investments in Egypt really cheap for outside investors. And then Saudi was stepping in, and they got their tourist industry to finally recover because it was super cheap. So you could go to Egypt for nothing. I mean, the most expensive part, Americans can't really do it because we're still on the American airplane travel system. But if you can get there, it costs nothing. So particularly if you're like Russian or Saudi or Chinese or any of the places that are only 3 to 4 hours flight away from Egypt, you could go there on vacation for pretty cheap, but that brought in tons of foreign currency to back up the currency. So the currency got stronger as this foreign currency came in, but it was totally dependent on tourism. But there's something else you need to know about Egypt. Egypt gets just under the amount of USD in military equipment. Well, it actually gets the money, but it has to use it to buy military equipment. As Israel from the Camp David Accord. It's the second largest recipient of U.S. Fiscal aid because of the Camp David Accords. And the deal is basically like, we're not going to give you as much as we give Israel, but we're going to give you almost as much. But here's the problem. They have all this military equipment, but the U.S. doesn't backstop their military budget. So the leaders get real poorly paid. Now, I don't know about you, but what do you think happens when you have a very well-armed army that's very poorly paid? Particularly when they have like arms that other people in the region, except for Israel, don't have access to. Well, the government had to deal with that. Now, how it dealt with it was to allow the military, as part of a supplement to individual people in its budget, to go into um and maybe it's the third. You might be right about Pakistan. It was the second largest. I haven't looked up the the aid rankings in a long time. But it gets whatever Israel gets, it gets right beneath that. And that's been true since the Camp David Accords. Um and they can only use it on buying U.S. military equipment, from what I understand. And I've talked to people in the Egyptian, like that were formerly in the Egyptian government, about this. Um, and so how the Egyptian government set this up is they gave the military like special carte blanche to like go into like resource industries, their own hotels, or yeah, well, Ukraine is definitely getting most of it now. In fact, I'll look it up just to be recipients of U.S. aid ranked. Um, yeah, Egypt's really up there, but it's not. It was the second. It hasn't been the second for a while. So let's just correct that. Um, uh, so so what happens with that? Okay, well, U.S. military contractors love it, right? So they can make new stuff for the U.S. military. U.S. military can just throw its Abrams tanks to the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government, though, has to pay its military because it's very well armed, um, uh, somehow, and they give it special access to a lot of the resources, both in the tourist industry and in the raw materials industry. And that's basically the only part of the industry that's modernized. There's other problems with this now. COVID hits, completely fucks up their ability to get foreign inputs through tourism, even though they just got their tourism back up. That hurts. Saudi Arabia has less largesse, and then the Ukraine and Russian trade stuff happens with wheat. Uh, Traditionally speaking, until the early 20th century, Egypt was the breadbasket of North Africa and Europe. Um, Egypt's still kind of the breadbasket for um, uh, North Africa. I'll get to why in a minute because it has all these wheat processing things. But since World War II, it's net imported wheat. Egypt is a net importer of food. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm going to put Sam here. Sam's absolutely correct. We've been Egypt's dominant force in the domestic economy for decades, like since the late 70s. Um, and CC is worse about this than so so. Oh, they have a lot of like bread processing plants, and bread is highly subsidized for Egyptians. Like a piece of bread is a few cents. It's the equivalent of a loaf of bread is like 30-40 cents, maybe. Sometimes it's as low as 5 cents. It's the staple food of a country that has 60% below the international poverty line. And believe me, I saw it when I was there. Um, so it subsidizes that, but it also processes the wheat from Ukraine and Russia. It buys more from Ukraine than Russia uh, to feed um, uh, not just its population, but since it processes all this grain so well, it also feeds a lot of North Africa and a lot of East Africa. Um, a lot of bread comes from Egypt to other places, not everywhere. And you can get the wrong idea that it's monolithic, but you know what I mean. Um, well, so what's the problem now? Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. And I remember when that happened. So now the Egypt has to buy its bread not from Ukraine and uh, Russia, but from the US and Australia to make up the difference. Because even though there are still some exports of wheat, um, yeah, that's a good question, Sam. We'll get to in a minute. There's some exports of wheat um, going on. There's uh, there's a whole lot of inflation around that, and it's also leading to food prices, and the government has to float its currency, which is just devaluing massively. Um, Try to deal with that, uh, and I was telling my friend, I was like, there's no way Egypt can just opt to have currency sovereignty in those conditions. They can't feed themselves, much less keep up their obligations to other nations. Now, let's throw in another caveat to this. Egypt is a huge population country. Its population is mostly on the Nile. Um, and there are water crises, and there's two water crises. Not only do you have your normal North African water crises, as you're surrounded by like literally 5 or 6 deserts, um, but you also have the problem of uh, increasing damming of the Nile to get strategic water reserves. Some of these actually don't end up being that smart. They cause water die-offs. Um, they also are massive security problems. For example, if the Aswan Dam was ever blown up, 80% of Egypt's population would be drowned within 10 minutes. So if you ever visit the Aswan Dam, oh, you are going through a fuck lot of security checks. Okay. I tell you all this not because it's interesting and cool facts. One, there's a real threat of like water wars. I don't think it's likely yet, but there is a real threat of water wars between like Egypt and Ethiopia, and in Eritrea getting involved. Um, but also because like when people talk about currency sovereignty, you have to know all these conditions as to why countries don't have it. It is not ideological. All right. And academics who tell you that don't know anything but the balance sheets. Now, there are people doing good work on this, even in MMT. I'm not shitting on all of them, but like when I say like currency sovereignty is directly tied to imperialism, and you can't convince me otherwise because of what I've seen, that's what I mean. Egypt's a perfect example of that. We can go through that with almost any country. Okay? Like we can talk about it with Europe. Like most of Europe's lack of currency sovereignty as a bloc is because of the political rule, and this in the sense is ideological, that they put themselves to get everyone to agree to go into the EU. Well, so while I do think that like some of the fundamental propositions said in MMT are right, when you're dealing with fiat currency, that they don't explain everything. And I think there's a lot of reasons why. Right? And I've said that because a lot of the redefinitions kind of blanket the what I call the normative description norm, and the norms here are changing the definitions from the way they're standardly used. Um, Although they would tell you they aren't, but if you've ever read actual MMT like not the popular books, but the actual policy papers, they are, and they're debating highly about it. That changes and hides some of these things. Just like neoclassical economics has a lot of shit that has way more than MMT does. Like let's be honest about that. Like, but and Marxist economics has problems, right? Um, as much as I want to believe it, as much as many Marxist scholars want to tell me that it's not true, even Grossman called out that Marxian capital assumes currency has a standard set value, even though in other places like the Kundresa, he does not. What are you going to do with that? I'd make Andrew Kleiman mad probably, but what are you going to do with that? This is a good question, and I'm going to talk about it. I'm new to politics. Everyone talks about unions leading to socialism. I don't know why they do that. I didn't work. It didn't work in the 30s. As you know, they got arrested union leaders or killed them. Actually, the best thing they did was to incorporate them into the government, more or less. Yes, they arrested union leaders and killed them, but they haven't been arresting union leaders and killing them since like the National Labor Relations Act. At least very rarely. They've been limiting their ability to do anything through official channels, and to maintain legal status, they have to play ball. And if they don't maintain legal status, they can't negotiate contracts, and so they can't play ball. I am reading Capitalist Power. I've talked to people about Capitalist Power. I am torn. Parts of it I find very convincing, but parts of it, like one that they say power is more concrete than value. And I'm like, well, when I read Fardron and Mackover, I can actually map out value as a statistical aggregate of net profits versus cost. And I can kind of talk about that. In power, I have to look at like many different indexes of all kinds of different things that are conflated into that. I don't know how one is less abstract than the other. Another thing, although I'm trying to finish their book because maybe they do explain it to me. Another thing is that there are costs to money. And those costs to money aren't just power. Now, the cost to money is close to zero. In the sense of the cost of money is close to zero if all you're talking about is the physical production of currency. But there's a reason why governments do care about the value of a penny versus the cost of copper. So yeah. See, this is to bring it back to my initial statement about Platypus. I read Platypus statement and I read it in 2011 and I was invigorated by it. But you know what? It doesn't get into all this. Or at least not the way most people do what Platypus wants them to do and what Platypus itself does. Like Platypus exists to show the love to itself so it can self-criticize itself to a better less and begin to really deliver on the promise of bourgeois values that the bourgeoisie have never really meant and that they can't deliver on, right? Well, I mean, it's very simple. The cost. Let's get back into that. The cost of money is the cost of printing or minting the money, and the cost of also maintaining the banking system, backstopping the banking system, maintaining the trade lanes, etc. That's also part of the cost of money. But even if you bracket that out and just look at the cost of currency, and all that other stuff is tied to power, but it costs something. Like it really does cost something. It costs something in commodities more than the actual currency because no one really gives a shit about the currency unless you get paid in dollars because everyone takes them. But this is why, a lot of not the people I've talked to, not Sam, but like Michael Hudson has like made predictions about the US dollar in the last 2 years that have just been objectively wrong. Like they've been talking about, even sometimes Twos has done this. They've been talking about how like the US dollar is going to be weakened by Russia's ruble setting and by China pulling out, and the opposite has been true. Even though people are de-dollarizing, it hasn't hurt the value of the dollar at all, and it hasn't de-dollarized the international market. It just means people want other things in their reserve currency because they're cheaper. Now, if that happened forever, yes, it would eventually lead to collapse, but it's not. And you know why it's not? Because the United States is food secure and the second most productive power in the world. And during COVID, it was the first. I mean, during this last round of zero COVID with China, it was the first. So, yes, the United States is absolutely declining. It's been declining since the 70s, and it's been real manifest since the 1990s. But Hudson said it would happen way quicker than it's not happening the way he's predicting at all. Right? I've read what he said. I've listened to these people for a long time, and I used to take them a lot more seriously. But you have to hold people accountable for being wrong. I am very serious that I'm tired of the left, like, not just like not, I get not chastising losers, but like we don't hold people accountable for being wrong. And we almost celebrate them for losing. As long as the US military exists, not just to enforce, but also to consume so much of the world's raw commodities, which it has to do. What do you think this uncontrollable military budget is about? Um, this isn't changing. And no one wants it to change because if it changes too fast, the entire world trade system collapses, particularly now that the Belt and Road Initiative has been nerfed. If America's declining, every country except China and India is too. Actually, China and India's GDP have both dropped, so they're declining too. Now, I think in the long run, they're more on the up and up than we are. But the thing is, even in a multipolar system, when the hegemon first goes down, everybody goes down. That's not even true under capital. That's like true in a since we've had nations and international trade. And we have to deal with demographic declines. Now, I'm not actually super worried about demographic declines, because while I'm not a Malthusian, I actually do think that like part of this is a natural adjustment to overcrowding. I don't say overpopulation because we're not, and the vastly unfair use of resources. But nonetheless, it does lower your productive capacity temporarily when that happens. It actually creates a lot of space for the working class, which is um, China's GDP as 2.5 before they reopened from COVID. It declined. It's been declining since 2008. GDP growth rate. It hasn't dipped negatively. The GDP growth rate is declining. Nobody dips negative. If the GDP growth rate is truly negative, it means you don't have profits in the system. Grow less is decline. You don't understand capitalism if you don't get that. Yes, it's positive. The United States has never had negative GDP either. Look, I take that back. It had negative GDP in the 1970s. That is it. We've been oscillating between like 1.8 and 3% GDP for like 30 fucking years. Our GDP growth, like coming at the beginning of this year, was 2.9%. China's was 2.5. That's decline. If you dip below, if your GDP hits zero, you are not making profits net in the system. Period. End of discussion. That's what that means. So it's relative GDP decline from a growth standpoint. But the biggest crisis that we had in the United States, it's a decline in growth. Yes, GDP decline is a decline in growth. When people say that, that's what they mean. Negative GDP is so incredibly rare that no one uses it that way. Does that mean that GDP growth will eventually dip negative? I don't know. No, by that point, we'll do something. I am very conflicted about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. One of the things I was saying about Marx is Marx seems to actually believe that that's true for the individual commodity price, and it's not. Grossman even says that. But it does seem to be true in aggregate, that the growth rate declines in every developed economy. A decline in GDP is a recession, correct? Not a negative. That like when they talk about like a decline, like a negativity in growth, they don't mean that GDP dipped below zero. It has like a couple times in the past in a few places. In the United States was one of them in the 70s, but it's incredibly rare. right? This is important to understand. When people talk about a degrowth economy, it's not a framing I like, right? It's not. I don't like that framing, but it's not because I want exponential use of resources to grow forever. No, a fall in the growth rate isn't a decline in GDP. Okay, a decline in GDP is a recession. Um, but we like. I'm gonna share something with you guys, just so we can like get on the same page here and not argue about semantics. All right. Okay. I hope you can see this. Um, GDP growth rate. GDP growth rate, and GDP per capita is probably maybe slightly more useful. There's problems with each of these measurements, by the way. I'm not foolish about that. Um, so, what we've seen, for example, I'm trying to find it going back for many, many, many years. So, let me see if they show me for the long time. Okay. All right. Here we see this side chart here. This is the chart we're going to be looking at over here. GDP per capita annual growth rate. The lowest that we ever were actually is in 1960, although uh, we can talk about those specific conditions. We were really high. We were really, really high in the 50s. Um, we can see here we have 2009 is a year of negative GDP growth. Right? Um, Now, again, this is per capita. This is adjusted. Um, we can see this change. Now, this is not what I was referring to in the 2 to 5% range, but we can see here that while you do have occasional dips in growth, that on average they've been between 2% to 10%. And when it bumps up a lot, it's usually because we just got out of a recession or some kind of exogenous shock. Now, I'm using per capita because it's a little bit more honest than gross GDP or net GDP, but that's also the numbers that I was setting there. You see the United States, for example, in per capita GDP is lower than Ireland. That's interesting. That's new. Um, and I suspect we actually find the per capita somewhat surprising. Like Germany's per capita is quite low, as is the United Kingdom's. Um, but if we are to look at, let's see, just GDP and GDP growth rates, not per capita. Let's see what we see. We see pretty steady. It flattens out in the 70s. And then in the 80s, it starts kicking up a lot. But none of it's like it was in the early 20th century. Yeah, no, GDP per capita is not adjust for it's not considering purchasing power or anything like that. All right, that's another thing you have to consider. Um, uh, so, okay, now let's look at productive capacity. All right, manufacturing by country, and I want you to notice now it's a little bit more complicated with the EU because the EU has both aggregate and individual country stats, which makes this a little bit confusing. But let's look at manufacturing by country. Well, this is the population involved in it. No, no, the top 10 manufacturing shows and contribute to the global. Yeah, so this is a percentage of the global manufacturing that happens in that country. Right now, it is still China, but China's at decreased capacity. China's been up to like 40% in the past, I think. The United States is at 16. Japan is at 7%. Germany is at about 6% of the world's economy. India is at 3. South Korea is, but we should adjust for demographic change and all that. And then Italy, and then France, and then look at the UK. Like I think a lot of people like need to come to a realization about the UK, and then Mexico, right? Um, China's still the top manufacturer. I was wrong about it. I was wrong about us supplanting it, although it was really depressed because of zero COVID. Beginning of this year, in the middle of this year. Um, so, but we're looking at aggregate stats. We're not looking at like what it means for the individual in any of these countries, right? And there's problems with each of these data. But what the idea that like everybody is like, you know, doing super well right now, are in a depression just doesn't seem to be borne out by the numbers. Um, it also you can't tell. Like you have to look at Gini coefficient to see relative inequality, for example. And even that's not a perfect. Like none of these measurements are perfect. Like anytime you set up math, what you put in and take out of the math really matters. But GDP growth rates are really important. That is kind of how you measure where everyone is relative to everything else. In developed economies, GDP growth rates almost never top 10%. In the GDP growth rate in the 90s and aughts in China was like 13, 14, 15, 15%. And in fact, a lot of the very wrong pundits thought that if China's GDP growth rate ever dips below 10%, the whole country will fall apart, which is bullshit, right? This is xenophobic bullshit. But nonetheless, that's something to keep in mind right now. The United States is doing remarkably well. And when you factor in some key things, like everybody underestimates Russia. And I'll tell you why they underestimate Russia. Russia has not developed its consumer goods economy really compared to like its capacity to do so ever. It's always invested mostly in resource extraction and in military hardware as its raw commodity development. And it has a very educated society, even way after the Soviet Union. But because of that, it's actually kind of way poorer than it probably should be. But what it has is really important because it has rare minerals and food, and also lots of natural gas. So, like, Russia is by every estimation, since you look at like the height of the USSR, Russia is a uh, declining middle income economy that had a resource boom uh, between 2003 and 2008-9, and has been stabilized by Europe wanting to go green, largely by purchasing Russian gas. But nonetheless, right? Um, uh, GDP growth rate has been has we have been, like, until very recently, in a somewhat stagnant period, through definitely from the end of the 90s forward. And we have the I kind of get frustrated that they don't show GDP growth, like, going back into, um like, the calculating it back into, like, the end of the long depression, because, like, there was massive growth. Um, and it's that period that you compare to, like, these industrialization pools. It was like during the during the Great Depression, the USSR was doing good because it was basically like doing all this massive industrial buildup, right? And that's going to, like, cause your GDP growth to basically skyrocket. And that's one of those times where it's kind of misleading, because, like, if you look at the average calorie intake from the USSR's own records for this time period, they were like 1,300 for not yeah 1,300 1,400 a day, somewhere in there. So yeah, that's not great, because one of the ways you measure, uh until modern society, one of the ways until modern capitalist development, like, just started flooding the world with calories, by massive overproduction of food, that you could actually kind of measure how people were doing, is rough caloric intake, right? And it's hard to measure that for certain time periods, but, like, for example, in China when Mao was a kid, right? um we know that uh the average rich peasant, all right, according to Mao's own classifications, and the rich peasant was kind of defined by his father's estate, um uh ate their family ate eggs about a few, like, 2 or 3 times a month. um Largely a vegetarian diet. Meat, was consumed a few times a year. Um, Now, average, not median, and there's all kinds of things with that, right? But I'm just pointing that out because, like, um, all these kind of things are relative. But if you were looking at, um, like, the GDP on international market and the industrial growth of the USSR in the 1930s, you would think they were doing amazing, and they weren't doing bad. But if you look at the USSR's intake of, like, what normal food consumption was, it wasn't great. Oh man, I did a whole rant one time about Peter Singer's book on Marx, which was a total misrepresentation. Um, People who try to tell me that utilitarianism and Marxism is compatible, like, are people that I want to fight. But probably this is probably the less sectarian in me more than anything. Yeah. No, yeah. Oh, yeah. The median probably was worse, actually. And I think we're gonna have to look at, like, for example, I'd be really interested to know in a bunch of years what we find out about, uh, what the average person right now, even though inflation is decreasing. Now, remember that most inflation rates don't account for food, or housing, or education. Um, but food inflation has been through the roof. If we look at, like, real inflation for household goods, which is always higher than the general inflation rate, usually not because of food. Usually it's because of housing and other things. Um, we will find that things aren't so great right now. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Alcohol. Yeah. Well, that's actually debated. I've actually looked up the studies in that. Like, alcohol does have calories in it, but exactly how much you process is unclear. Yeah. So yeah, the vodka probably didn't help. Probably means it was even lower. Um, do you think there will be another big recession in 2003 here in the United States? Right now, economic conditions are so strange that I'm not sure. I feel like there is a sectional recession, so that like the tech sector is basically falling out right now in a lot of ways. And the tech sector, by tech I mean tech rentiers, internet. I don't. There are other parts of the tech sector that are growing, transistors because they're being government subsidized. Certain parts of the market are coming back on. Notice when I say tech sector, like I don't mean everything in tech. I mean specifically like the internet. That is uh, declining uh, pretty precipitously. Venture capital is dropping, but the housing market, unfortunately, for a lot of people who want in it, is very stable because of a lot of the reforms made after 2007. There's just not a lot of floating rate uh, mortgages on the market. The construction industry is slowing way down, but it was also building up way up because of there was this housing glut. Well, not glut. There's lack of construction that went all the way back to the market falling out in 2007, 2008. And it was hard to get goods, and now all that's slowing down. I mean, it's not slowing down here in Salt Lake, but we're weird. So yeah. Um, so I do think you're going to see uh, a relative decline. Do I think it's a big recession? If it is, it's not going to look anything like 2007, 2008. It's going to come from different sectors. The question becomes like, how much is really being held up by these tech rentiers? How much does it really matter in the downstream to the economy, if it was just like a way for people to amass tons of paper capital. Uh, um, well, rents insane and going up because like housing prices are not going up and housing's not going up, but housing payments are. If you're opening up a new housing payment right now, you're probably still paying more because of the change in interest rates. So yeah. Um, so in certain areas, so I think like California is going to see things slow, um, and we might see things pick up in places like the more rural areas, like the Wyoming, the Dakotas, uh, um, and whatnot. Uh, so who knows? My feeling is you're not in a recovery period right now, but that in some ways, what happened during COVID may have bought us some time. But because you basically had a very intense mini recession for a very brief period of time, and the government actually intervened, which it normally doesn't really do. So, yeah. But I think no matter what, the next few years are going to be dry and expensive. Even if inflation significantly decreases, prices aren't going to go back down, and pay is not likely to go significantly up. So yeah, don't want. I don't like playing. I don't like over predicting from complex systems. I want people to understand how complex this shit is. Like the housing market stuff, I actually called in 2005. I was 25 years old. It was one of my first big calls. I wrote an article about it for a literary magazine. Um, you know, I don't know. Don't buy NFTs. That's for fucking sure. Um, if you have the money, buy land, right? But we don't have that kind of money. I don't have it, and I'm not poor by any stretch of the imagination. I've been homeless, not, I don't want to go my old poor, but it's actually weird. It's the weird thing about like left culture is like nowhere else in your life do you like brag about being working class. Um, in fact, it's sometimes like if someone calls you working class outside of left culture, it's like actually kind of insulting. But the moment you start dealing with like upper middle class workers and the strata that you normally deal with the left, uh, you feel like you have to insert it all the time because it's like it no longer seems like an insult. It's like, well, I've lived a real life, you know. God damn it. Yeah. Um, so yeah, I've been all over the place. The actual apology I've made, I'm glad I made it. I feel better. I've invited um the you know the founders on the show to talk about our differences. It's not a debate. I don't do fucking debates. I don't think they're always a waste of time, but performative debates are usually for um both sides reassuring themselves and maybe a couple of people uh changing their mind on witnessing. But most of that like internet debates that are highly performative really don't even do that. Because people have to seek you out, and they're already, if they seek you out, they're am I having control on? I've invited the leadership on. I don't know who's going to accept. All right. Do you know? Um, and I'm going to ask them to state their differences. And I'm going to be nice about it. Um, uh, as much as I like to get him to fight with everyone, it's it's more important. Well, this is the kind of stuff I want to talk about. I want to make people talk about this in concrete terms. All right. Um, what I hate is like when we're debate, like even more. I hate even more than the left sectarian stuff is debating performative pundits. It's totally debating perform. I fucking hate that shit. There are some people good at it. Every now and then, like I'll listen to Ben Burgess and he'll make a point that I'm like, oh, that's actually smart. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I think Ben's a smart guy, but our politics are very different. I'm just like, usually in debates, I feel like I know what's going to be said, and every now and then he does say something that I don't see, and I'm really impressed, right? But in general, it just doesn't do what I want it to do. I'd rather sit down and have a real conversation with somebody on a real level. Like I want to, I had Scott Horton on the show. Scott Horton's very, very right wing guy. He was actually important to me though, even after I left the right wing. Um, and uh, I didn't, I didn't stop um, him from saying whatever he wanted to do. Well, yeah, I've talked about that. I've talked about their provocation statements, which I think ends up being trolling, and I know why they do it. At least why they tell me they've done it. But I don't think it's effective, and I want to ask them whether they think that accomplishes. I like really want to do, all the time. Um, so I think that's important to deal with. Um, um, I am not particularly interested in being anyone's instrument these days. Um, I'm interested in being honest. I'm interested in fucking admitting when I'm wrong or when I misunderstood something. I try to show my thinking to you. Like sometimes I'm wrong. Like I've been wrong on these streams. Um, I think it's absolutely important to model that. It's not gonna make me fucking famous, but like I'm 42 2 years old. I'm not like super hot. I'm not gonna be, and I don't want to be honestly. Like that's not my life. That's not the life I want. Um, uh, but I do think we need to sit down and talk to these people. Colin Drum is coming on the show. We're gonna talk. We're gonna talk about our agreements and disagreements on Marx. Straight up. The Yeah, I'm not here to give people answers. I'm here to tell them facts and then like tell them how I interpret them and give you a way to think about it. It's education by modeling what it means to struggle through these thoughts. Like I really want to model integrity and epistemic humility sometimes. Um, but yeah. Question. I got one more question. Where's it at? Where's your question? I'll respond. Tell me what your question is, Persa, and anyone else. I'm gonna take 3 more questions. So, for the education you provide to be popular, what do you think is necessary? Well, I'll tell you what discouraged me. I was talking to Jason Miles this morning on the stream about Peru and how I think a lot of the narratives about Peru, the reason why the left doesn't want to touch it is because it's just too complicated for them. But we were talking about the elections in Turkey, and I think neo-Ottomanism in Turkey versus like Turkey's traditional like place is actually a real big deal in Central Asia and to understanding some things that aren't on the American radar so much. Um, and no one was watching that show. There was only like 30 people watching it. You know what they did? They said Turkey forces the vote, and it got a ton of fucking videos, like views immediately bumped up. That depressed the shit out of me because that implies that you guys are stupid. Like that the only way to appeal to you is about the most narcissistic and most wrong elements of our own political discourse. So, but I do believe in people. And so I tend to think part of that's the medium. It's the way the algorithm and the way people respond to immediate emotional responses. But when they think that they do better. And I'll tell you why I believe that. Because while my YouTube channel only has 3,000 subscribers, I am one of the 10th, I'm the one of the top 10%, not in the top 10, but I'm the top 10% of downloaded podcasts. And I have a similar Patreon subscriber number as Ben Burgess. You know? So it's a different approach. What I'm hoping happens, is you guys also, in your own ways, pick this up and do this where you work and live and what you do. I don't want you all to like. It'd be great if 1,000 YouTube channels started that sounded a lot like me, but I don't think that's going to happen. But and I've also like you guys have to admit like I've been doing this for fucking 12 years, as I told on Ben's show. Like it's been a long time. I'm tired, but I'm gonna keep doing it. I keep threatening to quit. I know you guys don't know. I don't threaten my audience with it, but like every now and then I'm like, I'm done. And Gene Bajalan's like, you love it. And I'm like, I don't. I love parts of it. I hate parts of it. It's a very complicated relationship. It's like the relationship you have with your parents. All right. Other questions. What conditions would be necessary in the U.S. to facilitate an actual civil revolution, in your view? We need to build up parapolitical capacity before we try to build up political capacity. We need to be able to protect ourselves and reproduce ourselves, and then we can talk about protecting electives and reproducing electives. And that is going to take getting out of the NGO mindset. You see glimpses of it every time one of these hashtag movement outrages or riots start to formalize into something, but then they get stuck in that NGO trap and the media trap and whatever, right? So that's the prerequisite conditions. What does dual power look like now? That's a big different question. It's not one I feel comfortable answering. I don't know. Why are you more friendly with MR adjacent shows than seemingly more leftist shows? Less dim cheerleader shows. You seem smarter than those folks, and it doesn't make sense to me. Uh, what left show? I mean, I'm on Antifada, so I don't know. That's where I really invest my time. I uh, have patched up some of my relationship with Doug Lane, so that I have that audience. Um, the reason why actually has to do with the fact that who's sectarian and who's not. Um, I would love to be more on, say, the um, uh, I don't know. I mean, what do you even consider leftist? Because I don't consider most of the media sphere leftist at all. Um, and people gravitate around the two biggest names in town, which are both millionaire comedians. Are people with uh, Katzenberg money. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you should look some stuff up. But yeah. Um, and that's why I'm in that orbit. Uh, they ask me to come on. Other people don't. If I had my way, if I had my way, virtual Jonathan, I would go on more not political shows to talk about politics. That's what I would do. I would go on elder signs, and I would go on what I do with the Sectarian Review. I would go on history things or book stuff, and I would bring this perspective to that. And I do that. The thing is, like, when I try to bring it back, you guys aren't interested, and the audience for that is smaller. But it's in some ways more important. It's where the real non-committed people are. Oh well, look, like I'm not saying you support anybody. Like I don't like any of. I mean, like I kind of tired of that whole debate. But I have helped people establish themselves as left media people, and if you monetize yourself, you're gonna drift them in a couple of different directions, and that's where it's gonna go. I think Antifada has tried its best to uh, um, not do that. And so that's the people I tie myself the closest with. Also, I just personally, they're my age. They have a similar perspective to me. And then why do I go on, like, say, Diet Soap? It's because, well, Doug Lane's literally the person who found me from obscurity, and why we have fought for a fucking decade. Uh, Personal friendship really does matter. Same with Jason. Jason Miles and I like met over an internet fight, and no one was really listening to his show at that time. And he asked me on, and I'm loyal to people who've been loyal to me. Um, but I don't like their politics a lot of the times. And Ben Burgess is a person I've known since 2014, before anyone fucking knew who he was. Um, uh, but the reason why, like, the most monetizing I will do is the Patreon. And well, I'll take that back. I do take podcast commercials for the free podcast feed so that I pay less on hosting. But I only tend to take commercials from other podcasts, and I don't limit them to any particular ideology. Um, uh, and but other than that, I don't monetize. I won't monetize this channel. I know my subscriptions would go up if I did, but I'm not going to do it. Um, uh, I don't think you win people by, like, you might win individuals by convincing them, but like, social movements aren't made off individuals, which is why I find the whole approach. Not that I don't believe that, like, people reason or stuff like that. And you know, and like, look, like with Ben, my exact, like, I actually said, like, politically, I thought he was a little soft. I've always thought that. Um, but that he's what I will say about him, and you guys say he's unhateable. A lot of people hate his guts. right? Some reasons I understand, some reasons I don't. Is there really a point to debating with young alt-righty sympathy right wingers for 4 hours podcasts and such? You might win 2 or 3 people over if if you really believe in like the evangelical approach to building a political movement, maybe. Um, but in general, I think it's a lot more effort than it's worth, and I think a lot of people hear what they want to hear in those. Um, yeah, that's So my I'm not saying there's no purpose in it, but it's not me. Um, I don't want to be any of those people. I don't want to be Destiny. I don't want to be Voss. I don't want to be Sam Cedar. I don't want to be. I just want to be me, man. This is a very simple thing to say, but like, I am a ex-working class dude who's a former academic who's a teacher, who has a right wing background. I mean, like the funny thing is, like I know the right wing, like pretty well. But I don't I don't see I don't think a lot of them are good enough faith actors to even like not those people. You can take someone like Scott Horton, or you can even take it like some pretty far right people and have a conversation with them, but and like publish that conversation and you can be hard at points, but fucking performing to debate, I don't see the point. No. Like, I think it can change some small things. I think it does have some function, but it doesn't have enough. You missed me apologizing to Platypus and then going on for an hour about the political economy of Egypt and why I disagreed with MMTers about currency sovereignty. No, because Scott Horton is a good faith actor. There's complications there. There's complications everywhere. But the thing is, like, if I'm talking to a right winger, I want to talk to someone who believes something, not someone who has a performative gesture role. If the performative gesture agrees to it, they think they have an edge up on you. Like, I'd actually rather sit down and talk to someone's weird Trumpy uncle. Like for real. I'm a redneck whisperer. I can do it. Believe it or not, when someone needs to speak to conservatives at my day job, you know who they send to do it? Me. um. So yeah, I mean, it's a thing. I pride myself, despite my temper, despite my incredible idiosyncrasies, and I have a lot, and I'm a very flawed person. But I pride myself in being able to do that thing that Lennon said you should do to really understand society, and it's not just understand it abstractly, but get a feel for the different elements of society. And in America, that's really hard to do, right? But um, that's really hard to do. Not just because of ideological sorting, but also because of economic sorting and racial sorting, mostly economic, frankly. I mean, the amount of people who think they know who the 1% are the wealthy are and have no fucking clue is kind of staggering. And I used to be one of them. But the one thing I will say, if the American left was ever a political movement worth having, we would have to win people over that a lot of people think are morally reprobate. In a lot of ways, not just in the obvious ones. And you're going to want them to stop being that, sure. You want them to change, but I want us to change too. I want us to be better people too. Like that's just the fucking truth. A lot of us have antisocial tendencies and are highly alienated people. And what, it's was, you know, um, I believe in things like programmatic unity, but I also believe we're not there yet. We can't just call for that out of nothing. Like, people ask me about like how I feel about Jimmy Dore Grayson, and I don't really give a fuck because a lot of those people are famous, but I do care about the people who listen to them. And I don't actually discount everything they have to say. Like when it comes to like the Russia-Ukraine war, I am totally willing to go. Like, I don't know what the right answer fucking is. Um and I see so many problems on all sides. Um and I said that about Syria, and with Syria, like, I still have nightmares about like kids that I taught who would like break down from shit they saw there. Like, it's just, yeah, I'm actually getting really upset thinking about it. Okay, this is it. Most people are decent people, especially 101. That isn't the point. They vote for and empower people who exploit them and others. Plenty of conservatives are wonderful family folk. That's not the point either, though. Like, most people, I mean, like, what, 30% of the population doesn't ever vote, even in a good year? Like, even in the highest, elections that we've had, there's, a third of society who can. That's just who can. That's not dealing with the people who can't, too. Uh, which is a large number than most people realize. Um, uh, I think I think people probably don't empower people as much as we think people take power. And the only thing you can say about this is our complacency about the whole system. And I think this may be your point, Jonathan. So I'll give you this credit. But if this is what I think you're done on, our complacency about the whole system empowers it. But often how you fix that is not obvious. Like, what, you're going to have a people's war against the U.S. government? Like, we laugh at like right wingers saying that because we all know they'll be mowed down by drones. Like, let's be completely fucking honest. Yeah. I want to thank you guys. I'm very exhausted and I've had a long week and I got to grade and write and do so much stuff. Um, I'm probably gonna burn myself out for it's all said and done. Um, uh, but this doesn't really feel like work right now. So I want to thank you for that. Um, yeah, a grunt still pilots the drones. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But there's an asymmetry of force. Now, I mean, if you want to get if you were fighting an occupier, the asymmetry of force would actually be in your favor. But when you both coexist in the same polity, it's absolute, absolute. Study. This is why I tell, like, I wish people would study war a lot more. It's a very dismal subject. It's a very dismal subject, but you need to. Uh, yeah, Sam, I'll talk to John H. Uh, oh, I need to talk to someone. You reminded me. I'm trying to help the Dual Power have a conference here in Salt Lake. So, and I will definitely be at that one because I don't have to drive across the fucking country when my cart broke down. So hopefully I can tell you more as I know more. I can't say much more because everything's still in the planning process, and I probably shouldn't have said anything now. But we are working towards that goal. Um, and um, yeah. And you know who's helping me? Really, my partner, like the invisible person who's like behind here. Yeah, um, my partner and my best friends do so much more for this. Not because they help. They kind of, well, Shallon does, but most people don't. But they make sure that I keep my head on straight. Because if I was only in your world all the time, I think I'd probably be super Stalin psychopath person. Um, you know, um, yeah, everyone thinks I'm joking about it. I'm not. Well, yeah, the thing is, right wing arguments aren't about arguments. That's another thing. Like, uh, uh, anyway, um, we could talk about that another day. All right, my droogs, go and be merry and be smart, or at least don't be dumb. Uh, good night.